So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this IRIS seminar. My name is Gaspar Schnitzler. I'm a senior research fellow at IRIS, and I will have the pleasure to moderate this discussion today. So before introducing our three panelists, let me quickly introduce the topic of the day. So this discussion is part of a series of national comments that we launched this summer on the topic, what EDTIB do we want/do we need? With the idea of comparing different member states' approaches regarding the future of the European defense industrial bases. In total, 8 authors from 8 different member states will present the vision of their country, helping us mapping member states' perceptions, priority, and fears regarding the EDTIB. This will allow us to get a global picture of how the EDTIB could look like in the future. Having such an overview and better understanding the type of EDTIB member states would like to pursue and promote seems particularly relevant to us, especially at a time where several incentives and tools have been adopted and are currently being implemented, such as, for example, the European Defence Fund, ASAP, or EDIRPA, but most of all at a time when the EU is planning to adopt a European defense industrial strategy. So to do so, we raised questions in those papers, such as, for example, what should the EU be able to produce by its own? Should priority be given to specialization in certain areas or to a presence in all domains? Do we need more consolidation? What are the main barriers to achieve an integrated EDTIB? Or how much emphasis should be given to industrial cooperation with third countries? So today we will discuss the first 2 papers of the series, the Italian and the German perspective, which were recently released. And for those of you who haven't read them yet, you can find them on the IRIS website online. So now that I've introduced quickly the topic of today, let me introduce our 3 panelists. So we have the pleasure to have with us today Ester Sabatino, who is a research analyst for defense and military analysis at IISS, and she wrote the paper dedicated to the Italian vision of the EDTIB. We also have the pleasure to welcome Leonard Schütte, who is senior researcher at the Munich Security Conference and who wrote the paper dedicated to Germany's perception of the EDTIB. And last but not least, we have also the pleasure to welcome Bertrand de Cordoue, who is head of EU and NATO affairs for defense and space at Airbus in Brussels, and who has an in-depth knowledge of European defense industrial issues. So thank you to all 3 for accepting our invitation. And it's a real pleasure to be with you today. So without further ado, I will now leave the floor to our first speaker, Ester Sabatino, for presenting her paper on the Italian vision of the EDTIB, and especially the main conclusion we can draw for it. So Ester, the floor is yours, and I wish you all a good webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaspar, for the invite and the opportunity to talk about this topic. So when Gaspar asked me a few months back to write a commentary on the type of EDTIB that Italy is pursuing and wants to pursue, and how as well the war in Ukraine changed the national perception and decision-making procedure, I thought that it would have been an extremely interesting exercise. And this is because actually in the last year and a half, a couple of years, there has not been such a tangible reaction to the international situation. Although, of course, the war in Ukraine helped in increasing the attention that is given to the sector, but the developments kind of are enshrined in longer term modifications of the Italian apparatus, so to say. So to make it clear, unlike other countries such as Germany, for example, who started its own Zeitenwende, or France was the first in Europe to talk about a war economy, Italy did not undergo a deep change in its strategic choices, nor was the 2021 directive from the Ministry of Defense on defense industrial policy updated or modified in any way. Before I talk about what are the main results of that are expressed in the commentary, let me probably delineate what are also the main aspects of the 21 directive. So the Industrial Policy Directive had a few lines of actions, among which first of all, the change in perception from a cost to the value of defense investment can be identified. And this is basically due to the fact that in Italy, the public perception when it comes to investment in defense is usually not that positive. So there is a focus in that document on strengthening the investment in defense to support the industrial base and to strengthen it through as well cooperation with partners or a better integration of SMEs in the defense industry. What is also identified there is that the government should try to support better export of defense products through the agreement. So the directive highlights the centrality of the transatlantic bond. And this is particularly necessary to highlight here because it then has repercussions, of course, on the way that Italy is trying to develop and strengthen the EDTIB. So the transatlantic bond and cooperation at the international level is particularly important because of the macroeconomic and strategic changes. And so in a way, EDTIB is considered an option to increase the competitiveness, the technological innovation, and the investment in the sector. So is it possible to say that the defense technological and industrial base is a priority of the government? It certainly is, but how how is the country trying to develop it? Before going deeper into this, let me just probably mention that in the 2021 directive, there was also a reference to the necessity to improve the planning of investments. And this is a topic that is a recurring topic in Italy, right? So in 2021, there has been the institutionalization of a multi-annual investment fund dedicated to defense for the period from 2021 to 2035. So it's a kind of a wide period to have a certainty of investment fundings. But these allocations are going to be agreed upon on a yearly basis. And at the moment, for 2023, this reached a total of 8 billion euros, which includes the allocations of the Ministry of Defense, as well as allocations from other ministries, like the Ministry of Enterprises and Made in Italy, and these allocations, the projection of these allocations are positive in the next years. So there is in this specific aspect a positive trend. And there is the projection that in 2025, from around 8 billion of the current year, Italy will will devote to this voice of cost 8.7 billion. So if this is a positive step, a further positive development through the improvement and the strengthening of the Italian defense industrial landscape is the ongoing work on the development of multi-annual investment and procurement laws that should provide industries with more certainty on contracts and planning reception of the countries, both from third states and industries based in other countries. It is a pity that the multi-annual programmatic document was not published when I had the chance to write the commentary. In fact, the document was supposed to be published in April, but it actually was published only a couple of weeks ago. And it reports something that is, again, important when we talk about the defense industrial base. The document focuses a lot on military technological research for the next years. And there is a plan at the moment to double even the fundings for military technological research and have reach 100 billion euro by 2025, and then have a constant increase of around 20% on a year-on-year basis to reduce the gap with major partners. And the document highlights specifically to reduce the gap with UK or France. But let me now probably come to the characteristics of the strengthening of the defense and technological industrial base to which Italy is working at the moment. So there is unfortunately not one single document that systematizes and concretely puts black on white what's the Italian understanding of such a base is. But it's possible, let's say, to depict some common lines or fil rouge in different declarations and documents coming from the MOD. So the industrial apparatus is understood as being a driving force for a stronger national strategic autonomy in scientific and technological research, which should be free or protected from external attempts of penetration. And this is something that was also restated in the multi-annual programmatic document, in which there is an increased focus on the so-called national defense system, which in Italian is the Sistema Difesa, which should bring together defense institutions on the one hand and the industry on the other side. So in Italy, a further aspect to look at with attention is the need to protect from supply chain interruptions. So both the COVID pandemics and the Russian war in Ukraine showed how unstable and potentially fragile the supply chain can be. And against this background, there is the understanding that it is not possible to work independently from partners and like-minded countries. But it is also reserves to ensure a proper combat power. So has Ukraine changed the priorities in procurement? So in a way, we can further see that there has been a tendency, at least in the last couple of years, to prioritize the development and acquisition of high-intensity warfare projects, like, for example, the long-awaited acquisition of MBT from Germany, Leopard 2A8, or the upgrade of submarines and naval fleets, as well as the development of GCAP together with the UK and Japan. But if one knows a bit what have been the procurement priorities for Italy in the last years, then it is already clear that the acquisition of this kind of equipment already constituted some priorities for Rome that were there before the start of the war in Ukraine. So coming to the EDTIB, how to foster a stronger European defense technological and industrial base. So Italy is working towards this end through the strengthening, first of all, of national industrial capacity that will then contribute to other projects at EU level, the involvement in EU projects like in PESCO and in EDF, and international cooperation. GCAP and F-35, of course, are two great examples in that regard. So cooperation is central for the government. And cooperation is not limited to EU member states, but is open to allies and like-minded partners This is also given to the composition of the national industrial ties, and as well as ongoing and past cooperative frameworks with non-EU countries. This is also one of the reasons why Italy advocated in the past the opening of both PESCO and EDF projects to third countries and third country entities, and was positive about the opening of a DIRPA to activities that include shares of components coming from third countries. And this is basically because Italy prefers to have a balanced level of autonomy, so to say, to eventually include cooperation with non-EU partners, should these partners have the expertise that is required for a specific project. But what would help increasing the development and improvement of the EDTIB from an Italian perspective is actually a further increase of available fundings and EU budget for common activities, as the country has limited room for maneuver for activities outside the planned financial spending. We all know that Italy is not spending 2% of GDP in defense. He's currently at 1.38%, and the projections to reach the 2% are at the moment to have it by 2028. But of course, from here up to 2028, we can't have certitude of this timeline. Further aspects that prevent at the moment to have a proper EDTIB from an Italian perspective are the major differences that there are with regards to export licenses, the use of the golden power, where actually the golden power is the Italian way of the name of the screening for foreign direct investments, and other procedures that are necessary to reach then the exchange of products at EU level. And all these characteristics are understood as being at the moment too divergent among member states. And this, of course, prevents to talk about proper EDTIB. One negative point, I would say, of the Italian case is that when it comes to priorities, as I was referring to at the beginning of my presentation, is that there is not a single document that defines the priorities in which Italy wants to focus on. And sometimes this could be understood by other partners as a difficulty in having a clear understanding of what the Italian understanding of EDTIB could look like in the future, and on which priorities the country wants to focus on. But let me probably finish by saying that actually, if there is one priority, I would say that the priority is to engage with dialogue with fellow partners at EU level to try to find a solution to work together. But yeah, I will leave it to here at this at the moment, and I'm more than happy to reply to any questions.
Thank you very much, Esther, for your very, very clear and very complete presentation. Maybe if I try to sum up what you said and also what was written in your paper, I found very interesting 3 points that are, let's say, core in the Italian defense industrial policy would be the development of local know-how, as you mentioned, the fact of gaining new expertise through collaborative programs, and improving the competitiveness of the national industry. And third point you just mentioned is also opening cooperation with partners outside the EU. But we will have the opportunity to discuss and debate all these points later in the Q&A session. Now I will give the floor to Leonard Schütte for the same exercise on the German perspective this time. Thank you, Leonard.
Thank you, Gaspar, and thank you to my fellow panelists. Let me start by saying that I really appreciate IRIS' initiative to design such a comparative study, because as we probably all know in this virtual room, Paris, Berlin, Rome, and others are not necessarily seeing eye to eye on defense issues. And I think generating better understanding of each other's perspective is absolutely imperative to make any progress going forward. So Russia's war in Ukraine has affected probably German foreign policy thinking more than most other countries' foreign policy thinking. Hence, Chancellor Scholz diagnosed a Zeitenwende, a turning point in German foreign and defense policy. And given Germany's economic weight and its ambition to really become a serious military player again in Europe, its decisions will shape the future of the European defense industrial base. So in this brief presentation, I'm just going to touch upon 3 issues, but I'm happy to elaborate on others. First, that is Germany's procurement decisions since February 2022. Then the war's impact on the relationship between the German MOD and national defense industry. And third, Germany's perspective on recent EU efforts to advance common defense industrial policy. And, ultimately, what I'm going to argue is that notwithstanding some very serious progress made since February 2022, Germany is yet to become the engine that drives European defense industrial integration. So, as you know, shortly after the onset of the war, Chancellor Scholz gave his famous Zeitenwende speech and announced the creation of the Sondervermögen, the special fund, worth 100 billion euros, dedicated toward closing critical capability gaps. In the same speech, Scholz also pledged that Germany would spend from now on more than 2% on defense. Now, that ambition has since been qualified. Germany will probably spend 2% in 2024, but only when including the special funds investment. And as it is absolutely impossible for anyone in Berlin to know how Germany will spend 2% come with 2027, roughly, when the special fund will be exhausted. I think that is important context for the debates on German defense industrial policy. While the sum looks massive right now, I think if you dig a little deeper, it is not as big as it seems. 18 months on from the creation of the special fund, it is now starting to become clear what Germany will actually use that money for. And it is becoming apparent that the European dimension is largely missing. Most of the major procurement projects are in fact American. That is the F-35s, Chinook helicopters, or the Patriot air defense systems, to name but a few. So in other words, and in fact that is something that the German Defense Secretary Pistorius has been pushing for, speed of delivery, availability has been prioritized over a more, say, European perspective in procurement decisions. And, in isolation, many of those decisions actually make sense. But collectively, there is a risk, a quite serious risk, that German defense spending decisions will actually exacerbate the defense industrial fragmentation in Europe, not improve it. Now, as you also probably know, there have been quite some serious problems with FCAS and MGCS, while German Defense Minister Pistorius and his French counterpart Le Cordoue affirmed that there is political will still for these projects. Many people I speak to in Berlin harbor some serious doubts whether the projects will see the light of the day. Germans complain that the French companies don't share sensitive technologies. They fear that they're essentially funding a French aircraft. Many Germans are skeptical about the contribution that the French make to the MGCS, given that German industry is leading on tanks and so on. So there are quite serious disagreements that are very vocal when you speak to people in Berlin, and I'm sure in Paris too. So in other words, fairly significant new defense investment has been made in wake of the war, but so far there has been little done to really further the vision of the European defense industrial base. The war has also affected the relationship between the MOD and the German defense industry. Traditionally, and that is, I think, quite a contrast to say how it works in France, there's been quite some distance between the MOD and the German defense industry. That is in part for historical reasons, because defense industry has been a very sensitive subject in German public debates, which also in part explains the German fairly restrictive arms export policy. But there are also sort of economic market reasons, because the structure of the German industry is just different. Many German companies are medium-sized, they're privately owned, and the German government has tended to treat the defense industry like any other industry in Germany. Now, there are things that are changing here. For one, public opinion on German defense industry is evolving in the wake of the war, and there are also signs that the arms export policy is somewhat loosening. The German government is currently working on an update of its defense industrial strategy, and indeed it has said that it wants to become a bit more interventionist, a bit more proactive in how it structures its relations with industry. And Minister Pistorius is said, at least, to have forged closer relations with the German defense industry, not least by pledging to reform the fairly cumbersome German procurement processes. But many problems remain. The German procurement bureaucracy has struggled to actually process the amount of procurement decisions. And as a result, there's been a lack of legal contracts for quite some time after the war, which initially prevented the serious ramping up of production capacities. And there remains to this day a certain distrust between the two camps, in part because many major projects in the past failed to deliver what they promised. On the EU initiatives, Germany has supported recent EU defense industrial initiatives, even if a bit half-heartedly, I would suggest. Germany is the biggest funder of the European Peace Facility, and it has repeatedly agreed to increase its funds, even if increasingly reluctantly. Germany has also supported DIRPA on ASAP, and it has pushed for designing these instruments in a fairly flexible manner when it comes to third parties, much more than I know that France would have liked. But where Germany and France actually did agree was to stop the Commission accruing some of the greater regulatory powers that it suggested in the first proposal for ASAP, to prioritize orders for companies and to gain greater oversight over supply chains and industrial capacity. So, you know, there remains some agreement between Paris and Berlin here. The German position on EDIB, you know, the long-term procurement instrument, unfortunately still remains somewhat unclear. From what I understand is that the federal government does want to, or thinks a bit closer to the French perspective here, in wanting to focus more on buying European, and the logic here is that is a longer-term instrument. And so, you know, that strategic perspective should play a bigger role. But it is yet to be clarified to me what Germany actually wants EDIB to do, and how it wants it to fund. And what I've heard actually is that many Germans are pushing to actually wait for evaluations of DIRPA and of ASAP before properly discussing the shape of EDIB going forward. And so, in sum, the German government has been cautiously supportive of EU defense initiatives, but continued its kind of traditionally fairly passive role in Brussels. Perhaps Bertrand will disagree with me, but that is my understanding. And so, just to wrap things up, the paper suggests that German defense industrial policy has changed significantly since February 2022. But perhaps not changed enough to really become the engine that it wants to be in Europe. And the combination of uncertain long-term defense funding, the relative neglect of the role of the EU, a continuing reluctance to resort to proper industrial strategy, and a fairly short-term focus have hitherto prevented that Germany actually pursues a clear overall strategy for the future of the European defense and technological industrial base.
Thank you very much, Leonard. Yeah, same as for Esther. Maybe if we should remember one key idea of your paper and of your presentation. I think the fact that you mentioned that the European dimension is missing in the German Zeitenwende is very interesting. You mentioned the fact that there has been a lot of off-the-shelf procurement from third countries, and the fact that German decisions will have a profound impact on the future of EDTIB, especially with the risk of exacerbating the fragmentation of the EDTIB. Before leaving the floor to Bertrand, I just would like to say to the audience, feel free to ask questions. There is a chat, so you can write your questions. I will pick the questions from the chat and ask them to the speakers. Please try to write some short questions, because otherwise it's a bit difficult for me to moderate and at the same time read the questions. Thank you very much. And now I will leave the floor to Bertrand to react as a respondent by, let's say, somehow challenging Esther and Leonard's conclusion with his vision as a representative of a key European defense company, Airbus. So Bertrand, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Oui, merci Gaspard. Bonjour à tous. Thank you for the invitation first. It's particularly interesting to contribute to this kind of exchanges when you are located in Brussels, representing a multinational company, which is actually the biggest industrial player in defense in the European Union. Difficult to summarize or to react to everything. I think the question of the webinar was what European DTIB do we want and need? I think everyone would agree that we want and we need an healthy, reliable, competitive industrial base for defense in Europe, able to provide the equipments needed by our armed forces in this particularly dangerous geopolitical environment. But to achieve this shared target, I think we have to define or to discuss how to proceed, and also who are the players around the table to try to converge on this objective. And to my understanding, after I heard Esther's and Leonard's reports about their national perceptions, I think there are basically four major players who are involved in this handover. First one, of course, are the member states, and there the member states, of course, have a key role. And I think in the current situation, they have to address, I think, two major challenges. This was obvious, seen from Rome and from Berlin. The first one, of course, member states are defending their national interest, or what they think is their national interest. But I think this has to be addressed more practically on two issues. The first one is to consider how they might shift from a national preference to a European one. For them to understand that industrial return is important, of course, but this is not the primary ingredient to achieve a competitive European defense industrial base, and that they have to consider that European preference might provide maybe a better added value, even in terms of geo return for their industry, but also to provide the needed capacities. So the first challenge considers that European preference is a way to meet their national interest. And there, of course, there are two considerations. The first one is the debate we had around they had around the different tools proposed by the European Union, the European Defence Fund and ASAP, EDIRPA mentioned already, both by Leonard and Esther, where there were some cumbersome discussion to agree on eligibility criteria. And of course, the key principle which was behind the discussion was whether or not to provide a European preference. I think this is something on which we don't need to be theological. I think there is room for some flexibility as recommended by the Italian government, because we have to organize that strict European preference wouldn't fly, because we are dependent upon third countries for some supply and for some equipment. But the overall direction should remain European preference if we want to feed and to nurture an industrial base which is competitive at European level. The second thing which member states have to consider is also that industry consolidation or industry integration is a way to overcome this national preference battle and competition among the member states. Because when you have a company which is cross-border, which is multinational, as it is the case of the company for which I am working, namely Airbus, then you address this matter in a different perspective, because you put a contract or you put an order to a company which distributes the work among its different facilities and sites. This is what we succeeded to achieve in an outstanding way for commercial aviation, and that's something which could be replicated to some extent also in defense. The second point on which member states' role is important, I think this is also in the current situation where everybody is focused on the current crisis and focusing on how to provide the equipment needed, especially by the Ukrainian armed forces. I think this was one of the targets of the two recent instruments, EDTIB and ASEP, which is well recognized. But at the same time, the member states, in discussing that, shouldn't forget the long-term perspective, the preparation of the future, the investment in research and technology, which will provide the necessary competencies to build the future capacities and the future industrial joint programs. I think it's understandable that today, as it is the case obviously in Germany, the governments are addressing the needed capacities from an urgent, even off-the-shelf point of view. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget, if we want a competitive industrial base in Europe in the longer term, to invest in the industry and the technologies which will sustain the future programs. Of course, FCAS was mentioned, MGSS was mentioned. This is where the investment is absolutely needed if we want to have these industrial capacities for the future. So this was for the member states. Another key player, of course, is the European Union, with progressively increasing its role in this field, which was for long forbidden to the European Commission, but now through the European Defence Fund, which is a long-term investment tool, but also now through the more shorter-term instrument ASAP, EDIRPA, and maybe EDIP. So there is room for the EU. I think we are there considering the usual kind of turf between member states and the European Union, where member states are resisting to transfer competencies to the Commission. This is something we experience in many other domains of the European construction. But I think for defense, it's legitimate because it's even more sensitive than other internal markets topics or domains. But I think we have to accept that now the EU can play a positive role in helping member states to better converge on priorities, to better converge on the right capacities they need, and to spend better the money they are increasing to spend on defense through more jointly undertakings through a channel which is the EU budget, which is a joint funding channel. So therefore, the EU shouldn't be shy in taking a role in this building of an industrial competitive basis. And also the EU has a role to help member states to recognize that there is an interdependency, that they are depending upon each other, that there are things for which they cannot provide the capacity on their own on a purely national basis. This demonstration has already been made on several occasions, but I think the EU has a key role also, pedagogic role, I would say, to show and to highlight where there is a deficit of non-Europe, where member states will anyway not achieve anything if they stay on their own. And I think this is particularly important towards the bigger member states, not to quote anyone, but of course, you know what I mean. So this is for the EU. Then of course, and then not least, a third player is the industry. Industry should keep modest. We are there, of course, to supply capacities. We are there to adapt to the new ways of procuring equipment. We are perfectly understanding that we're entering in a kind of war economy. War economy means that there are war constraints, that the governments have a say and have the say on what they need. So it's not for industry to say what should procure member states or what should the EU fund. I think we have to respect this relation from the buyer or the user on the one hand and the provider, the supplier on the other hand. I think this is important to recall because sometimes we are impressed how much the industrial considerations are influencing actually the procurement policies of member states. I think war economy is changing a little bit this relation and re-establishing the relation, which of course is the right one. This doesn't mean that the industry doesn't have a say. Of course, we are aware about what we are able to develop and to propose, and therefore it's important to consult industry, especially when considering the future capacities. I think it's important that industry can provide views in the planification of the future, in the technology which could be considered for future equipments and programs. Of course, on FCAS, the whole industry is key to provide views and to develop the new system from an industrial technological point of view. And I have to say also, to react a little bit to what was said by Leonard, the comments which are flourishing in the press about the FCAS facing difficulties don't reflect the reality of the work which is currently undertaken there again at working level under the contract which has been put by the three participating member states, Germany, France, and Spain. Multi-billion contracts actually, so there is a lot of work to be delivered, and there the return we have, and especially from the Airbus teams from Spain and France and Germany, is that the technical working level is now entering in this project, is considering the collaboration, is sharing data and information. So therefore, if you start to work together, as we did in the past for the commercial aviation, then the engineers get together and can work on an harmonized way. And this is today the reality, which is not so well known when you come to communication and to political consideration. I think it's important to insist on that. And the fourth player, sorry, and this will terminate my contribution, is, and I think it's important, and this webinar is demonstrating where they are, is the think tanks and the researchers. I think it's very important that there are people who are external to this competition between companies, to the constraints of the procurement policy by member states, the budget, who are reflecting on that. I think organizing a meeting like this one, where views from different member states' origins are shared, compared, is a very useful. And I would like to thank IRIS for organizing this kind of thing. And when there are papers or food for thought papers which are produced by these think tanks, I think this has an influence, and a much more, I think, important influence that press release or what we can read in newspaper, by providing ideas, by clarifying the situation, by providing facts. I remember that IRIS published a couple of weeks ago a paper which was clearly highlighting the share of procurement by EU member states coming from third countries, I think around 80%. And that's immediately interacted with the discussion in the EU circles, in the member states, and everyone considers this was an unacceptable situation, that it should be reversed and so on. So, and it was just a think tank paper which launched this debate, which was, I think, very productive. It's also a way to make sure that in the capitals understand that things are developed differently in other countries. I think the exchange we had between Italy and Germany in this webinar is a good example of people trying to explain how it works by their countries. I think it's important that this is shared. I remember last week I attended a public presentation by a high-ranking responsible from the French procurement agency, saying that there was a huge difference between the French and the German procurement policy, because in France they were considering at first the operational capacities to be delivered, and in Germany they were at first considering industrial consideration and priorities. I think what Leonard explained to us is exactly the opposite, because even in Germany, to meet capacity priorities, they buy off-the-shelf products on the other side of the Atlantic instead of feeding and contracting their own industry. So therefore, capacity is also obviously a priority on the German side. So you see this kind of misunderstanding with building progressively opposition and hindering the collaboration. I have another example. I know that in Roma, I think this was mentioned, or at least suggested by Esther, there is a fear that the EU developments in defense procurement should favor the French, because the French are more influential, because the commissioner in charge, Thierry Breton, is a French, and so on. So therefore, there is this reaction, Italian reaction, that the French are taking the power in Brussels. And when I listen to my French fellows, they say, well, in Brussels, the Italians are very efficient. They are introduced everywhere. They are instrumentalizing the EU tools towards the Italian interest. So you see this kind of superficial perception creating difficulties in the collaboration. Anyway, I terminate here. Thank you, Gaspard, and of course, happy to contribute to the debate, if any.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. Very, very clear and well organized presentation, and thank you also for putting us in the four key players regarding this issue. So the think tanks. Now I will open the floor to the Q&A session. We have a bit less than half an hour left. So we had already a lot of questions, and sorry for the questions which weren't answered yet, because we had a little problem with the chat. So the chat was only open 10 minutes ago. So it's possible that we missed questions that you sent at the beginning. So feel free to send them again. I took 3 questions for the first round. So one on export control, one on the ramp up of production, and the third one on the cooperation with Ukrainian defense industry. So maybe first on export control. So the question is about the agreement that already exists between France, Germany, and Spain on export control. UK and the Netherlands are candidates to join this trilateral agreement. 2 questions, one to Esther. Is Italy considering joining this agreement as well? And question to Leonard, how much is Germany supportive to enlarging this agreement to other countries? This would be the first question. Second question on the ramp up. It's a question that is more dedicated to Leonard. So is the German industry ready to open new production lines and build new factories? And is the government ready to finance long-term contracts for the industry? And third question, maybe to both or to all three of you, about the cooperation with the Ukrainian defense industry and the future role of the Ukrainian defense industry in the EDTIB. How is this taken into account in your respective countries? And maybe also, how is it taken into account by major industrial players such as Airbus? Is it seen as a partner or maybe a challenger? Yeah, how do you see future cooperation with Ukrainian defense industry? Thank you.
Gaspar, should I go first?
Yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bertrand, also for your comment on the both the Italian and German case. Well, actually, before coming to the questions, I would like to have a kind of a reaction on the EU preference that you referred to, Bertrand. And I agree with you that EU projects should kind of, and production also at the European level should reflect EU priorities and become EU preferences. But I think that at the moment, the way that the defense industry is structured, the way that capability development is prioritized is not, that does not allow at the moment to have such European, the development of such a European preference or priority, so to say, because we are too much still focused on national priorities. So when it comes to export, the agreement that was referred to in the question is basically the agreement for FCAS, and in that agreement there is the delineation of the minimis clause. On export, it is in fact one of the topics that is being addressed by the Italian government, in the sense that also in my presentation a reference to the necessity to have a more common procedure also to when it comes to export. And I know that the enlargement of such an instrument would be pretty much preferred, actually, from the French administration, that would prefer to have a bottom-up approach, so to have member states to agree instead of having a European, more Europeanized export control policy. So I think that here the question that should be addressed is actually also on the typology of the technology that is included in the level of percentage. I'm not sure if the 20% of components can be for Italy, but I think that
Esther?
Yes,
we lost you for a couple of seconds. Could you just you were speaking about 20% and then it was
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. So I was saying that I'm not sure if the discussion on 20% on that specific percentage is the one to have also at the wider level at among EU member states. But I think that actually that should be more coordination on the type of technology that is included in the percentage that is required in order not to have an agreement to have then export. So Italy could eventually be willing to engage in such a discussion, but I think that actually what is needed more than an agreement at member states level is more a European approach, because otherwise we'd end up having different ways of conducting export and different standards, so to say, among member states, and that could be a problem when there will be the production phase of projects that are currently developed about at EU level and thinking about the next step of the EDF projects and the future results of this. So I think this is a very central question, but is definitely, at least to me, my understanding is that is not sufficient to have few member states agreeing on this, although it can be considered as a way to foster more agreement than from the core to enlarge to other countries.
Thank you, Esther. Maybe before giving the floor to Leonard, would you like to just say a few words about how is cooperation with Ukrainian defense industry perceived in Italy, and do you see it as an opportunity for EDTIB, or what could be the cooperation between the European defense companies and Ukraine?
Yes, that's a very tricky question, also because, of course, it has extremely strategic repercussions, right? I mean, we saw, well, actually, this is probably more a question for Leonard, given the recent agreements of the last weeks. Italy was not included in the Ukraine fund for defense industry. So it was interesting from Italy. That was not. That was a surprise, so to say. It is also true that it is not possible to say how much Italy is delivering to Ukraine, because that is considered as sensible information. But let's not forget that actually Ukrainian facilities already had engines for space launches, for example, that have an industrial production there. So, of course, there are certain types of capabilities that can be included and integrated in the EDTIB. But again, this is a topic that should be addressed not only now, but also at a later stage, and also with relations to what will come next for Ukraine. So is it Ukraine going to be included in the EU, and so how does it change and the balances among EU member states, or is it ongoing cooperation with non-EU countries? So these kind of questions, I think, that will need to be addressed also at a later stage. But the defense industrial apparatus in Ukraine, I think it's can be considered as a way to increase EDTIB.
Thank you, Esther. Leonard, would you like to answer?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you for the challenging question. Let me first briefly make the point on export control. I mean, Esther already covered a lot of ground. So all I want to note is that indeed, I mean, the German government has expressed explicitly that it does want to use the intergovernmental agreement and enlarge it. I think in an ideal world, the German government would also like to have an EU approach. But as we know, German arms export policy hasn't been terribly popular in the EU, and it doesn't have many natural allies in actually pushing its interpretation of what the arms export policy should be. So perhaps doing this bottom-up based on intergovernmental agreements is the way forward. On Ukraine, I have to admit, I'm not really privy to any information that probably all of you are not. The German and Ukrainian defense industry attended a business conference here in Berlin a few weeks ago, and I believe Rheinmetall has announced that it will open a factory in Ukraine, or at least wants to. So there is quite some movement. What precisely the stance of the German government or the MOD on this is, I'm not so sure. So I'd here defer to perhaps other experts in the virtual room.
Thank you, Leonard. And maybe on there was a question, was more addressed to you on the ramp up of the production about is Germany supporting the opening of new production lines in Germany and the building of new factories? And if so, how is the government ready to finance long-term investment in the defense industrial tool?
Yeah, I think here the conversation has been fairly representative of conversations elsewhere, in that at the beginning, in the immediate aftermath of the war, everyone believed that the defense industry would just do it based on political commitments made. And then upon realization that actually there wouldn't be that much of a change without legal contracts, the German MOD tried to initiate those, but processes have been frustratingly slow. Of course, now over the past few months, pace has picked up. Contracts have been given out. There is greater certainty, and I think that is beginning to translate into greater production capacities. But there's been the Titan vendor hasn't been sort of in fifth gear. Things have been very slow for bureaucratic and political reasons. And I think that argument pertains to the Rambo production facilities in particular.
Thank you, Leonard. Bertrand, would you like to react or to answer to some of the questions?
Well, I have to be cautious because arms export policy is a very sensitive issue, probably the one on which member states are the less ready to transfer competencies to the European Union or to the European Commission. But they have also to face the reality. The reality is that, first of all, there is already at EU level an agreed position on that topic through a common position which was adopted some years ago and which is fixing at EU level the principles to conduct an arms export policy. But of course, there are theoretical principles. There is no binding rules at that level for the time being, but at least there is a common ground of how to approach this issue of arms exports between the member states. Secondly, member states have also to recognize that they are not, as of today, entirely sovereign to decide to export military equipment, since many of them, not to say most of them, are depending about third-party suppliers. This is, of course, obviously the case for collaboratively produced equipment, but it is also a case for nationally produced, where some sub-elements or equipment have been imported. And of course, the best example is the ITA rule, which to some point could block an export contract. So therefore, first of all, there is already an agreed common position, which is purely political, but at least this is recognizing that at EU level there is a common vision of how we should proceed. Secondly, there are interdependency and even from third countries. And the third point, which was already mentioned, is the trilateral agreement. So at least 3 member states, France, Germany at first, joined by Spain, have accepted, with of course exception rules and so on, but they have accepted on collaborative equipment to have common rules on the decision making of export authorization. So there again, the reality is not black and white. There is an in-between, and this might evolve because it's also a concern, and it's a concern for us, industries, that at some point export policy could become a showstopper to collaboration. It's interesting to see how people are anticipating that issues on the export of the future FCAS, when there will be an FCAS, could justify to stop the program. The FCAS will be available in more than 15 years, so therefore nobody knows exactly what will be the context and the export policies at that time. So therefore, I think it's important that this export issue is recognized as sensitive, but is recognized also as not entirely sovereign from the national point of view, and also shouldn't be considered as a showstopper for future strategic collaborations.
Thank you very much, Bertrand, and thank you to all 3 of you for answering these first questions. We have a few other questions, and as we have 10 minutes left, I will take another question round. So we have a question on procurement choices by Brice Lançon. So Brice, you mentioned that as published recently in a study published by IRIS, 80% of procurement since the beginning of the war in Ukraine are not European, and that we have to reverse this trend. This was also mentioned by Bertrand earlier, and that this would be consistent with the goal of supporting the EDTIB's competitiveness. So your question is there a clear understanding of these issues in different member states? So let's say in Germany and Italy in this case, and is there a willingness in your countries of being less and less dependent on third countries? So this would be the first question on the external dependencies and procurement. And then there is another question. It's more a question for Leonard on the European Sky Shield initiative. So the question is or not Germany, as leading the European Sky Shield initiative, open to considering European solution instead of only German, US, and Israeli solution? Namely, so IRIS, Patriot, and Arrows 3. Thank you. And also to Esther, how is Italy considering this Sky Shield initiative?
Gaspar, who do you want to take the floor?
It's up to you. Maybe you can start if it's fine for you.
Yeah, sure. Let me briefly comment on the first. If I rephrase it, is European fragmentation considered to be a problem in Berlin? And I think intellectually it is. I think everyone is aware of it, and it is aware that that is both from an interoperability and from a simple efficiency standpoint problematic. But among the priorities for procurement decisions, it doesn't rank at the top. So, and I think to some extent, I have sympathy for that position, because if you look at the capability gaps that the German Bundeswehr has, it really cannot afford to wait 15 years for something to arrive. Now, having said that, I think it is striking how consistently, how consistent the decisions were in purchasing US-made systems, and in a way that transitions to the second question, and Sky Shield, when they were, so I understand, European alternatives. The argument that we needed to strengthen the EDTIB, again, didn't feature very much in procurement processes. So when you speak to people in the German MOD, you know, it's almost as though the middle dimension, so between national and transatlantic, the European dimension, is marginalized. For many officials in the MOD, we talk either about national procurement or defense cooperation with the US within a NATO framework. And that in part is because there is quite some skepticism towards collaborating with France. I think in many ways that is mutual. If you look at how FCAS and MGCS have been working, even though Bertrand, and I hope he's right, painted a somewhat more optimistic picture. It is also because many officials are socialized within a NATO framework. For them, when you talk defense, you talk NATO and not the EU. And that also undermines that European dimension.
Thank you. Esther, would you like to react?
Yes, sure. So on the first question on the procurement choices, well, Leonard in his presentation used the words speed of delivery. And I think that this is also something that can be applied to Italy, in the sense that when it comes to procurement choices, speed of delivery, at least at the moment, is something that is playing a role, as well as the level of technological development, in the sense that Italy is not against of buying European products. It has so many programs, ongoing programs that are focusing on Italian as well as European productions. But when it comes to specific sectors, then the priority is on the available products online, outside that provide the necessary capability power that the country needs. We could argue that probably the GCAP cooperation is something that is going outside of it. I'm not a fan of having two parallel programs, if I have to be honest, in this framework. But actually, for other procurements, there are several programs that are favoring EU or European, more broadly, products. When it comes to ESI, so the European Space Shield Initiative, where actually Italy and France are cooperating on the air defense sector. Italy is willing to improve the number of the SAMT that the country has to almost quintuplify the number of systems in the country. Has ongoing cooperation with France and the UK on PAMs and Asters. So I mean, of course, the country also believes in this type of solutions. So if on the one end it's definitely a positive initiative that several EU member states are working together and developing, working together in ESI. On the other side, of course, available capabilities that would also include cooperation that includes Italian production would have been preferred. But having said that, I think that the reaction at first was probably not that positive, but then it's not on the radar anymore, I would say.
Thank you very much, Esther. Bertrand, would you like to say something on this, or otherwise I take other questions?
I can reiterate that I'm a supporter of European preference, but it will not help. But no, I think this issue, there is maybe a small point which is important, and where the EU can play a role, which is the procurement process. And I think what creates a kind of imbalance between the European offer and the other side of the Atlantic offer is the possibility to procure equipment from the other side of the Atlantic through the foreign military sales process. And this is, of course, making the life of the national procurement agency much easier, because the contract has already been negotiated, and they just have to countersign a proposal which is stamped and guaranteed by the DoD. And such a system doesn't exist in Europe today, of course. But EDTIB could have as an objective to provide this one-stop shop procedure, which would allow member states to jointly procure equipment through one agency, which would be a European agency or even a national one if they accept to go through this national agency. But having established on the European scene a mechanism which would facilitate joint procurement would certainly make the life of the procurement agency easier, especially in small and medium member states where they don't have a big procurement agency with a lot of experts and engineers.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. As it is already 45, and we would like to give you the opportunity to have lunch if you hadn't lunch yet, I think we will end the webinar in a few seconds. Sorry for the question we couldn't answer. There is, for example, a question on the future of FCAS. Will it survive? I'm sure there are a lot of things to say, but this would need one more hour to discuss. So maybe could be the topic of a future seminar. Thank you very much to all three of you for taking the time to answer the question, for your presentation. Thank you also to the audience for your great questions. It was a pleasure to be with you today online, and we will have a further seminar of this kind in the coming weeks and months for the publishing of the next papers of this series. So thank you again, and see you soon.